So I changed the title a little bit because as I was working on this presentation, I realized, well, not everybody I'm going to talk about considered themselves African. So I thought maybe I could just say World War I and the rise of nationalism in Africa, because the one thing they all were is they're in the continent, not necessarily African. So I have divided this presentation into about 4 different parts. I picked up mostly by focusing on parts of the continent that had theaters, active theaters of war. But that doesn't mean that there's no nationalist activity in other parts of the world. I just did that because the continent is so big and so complex. There's just no way that I can tackle this topic comprehensively in 1 hour, 15 minutes. So the places I'm going to talk about are this little protrusion here and the mass of land behind it, which, as you can see, is what is referred to as French West Africa. The French also have this territory here. And then I'm going to hopscotch all the way to this part of Africa and focus on British East Africa. And then I'm going to also talk about the Union of South Africa at the base here. Oh, and I forgot, I'm also going to talk about Nigeria and the Gold Coast. I thought I should throw in some parts of the continent that didn't really feel the heat of active theaters of war, but nevertheless, we do see certain forms of nationalism arising as a consequence of the war or inspired by certain aspects of the war. Okay, so moving on. So that's little protrusion that I just talked about. This little protrusion here is this one here. So this is the modern-day country of Senegal, and you can see the odd mapping here. This is the Gambia, but I'm not going to talk about the Gambia today. And on this map, you see 4 numbers. Each of these 4 numbers represents a commune in French, or what really are municipalities, much like they are administrative units in France. So basically, the French are transferring their own forms of urban organization to their colonies. And there are 4 of them. The one that's most important for the period I begin to talk about is Saint Louis. And when were they established? Well, they're not established at the same time. They arise as a consequence of the slave trade. This part of Africa had lots of European visitors, and it had different Europeans claiming ownership of this territory over several centuries. So initially, it was the Portuguese during the age of Iberian expansionism, and then the Portuguese were kicked out by the Dutch and the British, and then eventually the French take it over in 1677. And when they take it over, the primary commodity is slaves. They also had a bit of gum, but mostly it was, that was the commodity of the Atlantic trade. So not surprisingly, that's also the commodity of this part of Africa. Okay, so skipping again over a huge period of time, I'm just providing a bit of background. We have the French Revolution in France, and the impact of that on French territory in Africa, in these particular parts of Africa, is they try to provide their own democratic adjustments to the political process. So for example, all males who lived in these municipalities were given the opportunity to vote if they became French citizens. So it meant that the French living in these communes, as well as Africans who were living there who became French citizens, could participate in an election. And then later on, they also got the right to elect one representative, one African representative to the Chamber of Deputies in Paris. It sounds interesting until you get to what it really meant to become a French citizen. The bar was really high. So for example, you had to speak French, which, you can learn French, but you also had to change your life in many other ways. So for example, you had to become a Christian. Most Africans who, not just the ones living in these communes, but generally most of French territory, they were mostly Muslims. And the ones who were not Muslims were followers of various African indigenous religions. So you couldn't be a Muslim or the adherent of an African indigenous religion and be a French citizen. You had to recant your faith and then take classes, become a Christian, and then you could become a French citizen. On top of that, you had to change everything, the way you ate, the way you dressed, the way you raised your children. You had to go to school, get a decent amount of education, in French, of course. So in reality, the number of Africans who became French citizens and could actually participate in electoral processes was very small. Probably maybe just about 15,000 by the time you get to the end of the 19th century. 15,000 in a territory of, say, about 15 million people is a very small number. But anyway, that is what it meant to be French citizen in these communes. So that was a policy called assimilation. And it's an interesting, these days we hear so much about different forms of nationalism in the news, and sometimes people will say something like, well, they're not integrating, or they don't integrate enough. And integration seems to, in many ways, seem to mean the same thing of changing your identity in many forms to fit a certain type of sort of ethnic nationalism in some way. But anyway, that was what it meant to be. And then what happens as you're approaching the First World War is the French begin to claw back on a lot of these liberties that they had given to Africans. So for example, they lose the right to French citizen. Even those who had acquired it were finding it difficult to hold on to their French citizenship. And then voting, they added certain qualifications for voting that made it even more difficult to pursue that. But you could, if you were a French citizen, still vote, stand for election theoretically, and get that one seat in the chamber in Paris. And one man actually made it. This is what colonial Saint Louis looks like. I just wanted you to see a picture of what, So one man actually made it, and his name is Blaise Diagne. So Blaise Diagne goes through, he's born in very humble background. I think his father is, his father is blue collar, is a cook actually. But, he really absorbs the assimilation policy, and he was known to say things like, our ancestors, the Gauls, when he was making his speeches. So he really, takes this assimilation process to heart. What pushes him into this form of nationalist activity is the withdrawal of those rights that they had gained in the early 1900s. So as you're approaching the First World War, Blaise Diagne and other elite Africans like him are not happy, and they form a political party called the Young Senegalese, or Senegalais, I think in French. So they form a political party and they begin to agitate. And he actually gets elected, makes it into the chamber. Now, at around this time, the French also, because theirs is a very expansionist form of nationalism, they are occupying more and more territory in the interior, they had shifted from assimilation to a policy called association. Association meant that now the goal wasn't to become a French citizen anymore. It was an acknowledgement that we are expanding too fast, and this ideal that we have is never going to work, because look, it's not even working in the communes. So why should we think it's going to work in this vast, expansive hinterland? So they came up with association, and what it essentially meant was you can keep your culture. Now you can be a Muslim or an adherent of whatever African indigenous religion. You don't have to speak French or anything. but the reality is that you can never aspire to French citizenship. And because the French had this idea that theirs was, the superior culture, it made everybody a more worthy human being. If you couldn't be a French citizen, then you were essentially agreeing that you are subordinate. So the policy of association, I have a lisp, and man, those essays sometimes. So that policy, so that policy essentially meant that the sort of government that was taken to the hinterland was a more martial form of government. It was a military government in direction, in nature. You had military officials or quasi-military officials who were given allotments of the interior to run. They had chiefs, who apparently were representing their people in certain small councils, but in reality, they basically were carrying out the orders of, military officials, like labor requisitions, food requisition, et cetera, et cetera. Now, moving on ahead, when you get to the First World War, the French decide that their colonies are going to have to contribute substantively to the war effort. And one of the ways they were going to contribute was through have boots on the ground. And they actually had a goal. So Paris communicated to administrators in West Africa that they wanted at least 1 million soldiers recruited. In the end, they only ended up with something like about 180,000. But the goal was 1 million soldiers. Blaise Diagne ended up playing a really key role in this recruitment process. Like, he literally was going around the hinterland, making speeches and encouraging people to enlist. So he became the face of this recruitment effort. And it's estimated that about a third, so about 60,000 of those soldiers who joined the French war effort were Blaise Diagne's ocean, or were inspired by Blaise Diagne. And part of the reason why he participated is because he thought he had gained a concession from the French government that everybody who enlisted and, of course, came back alive would be given French citizenship. And it would be French citizenship of the classic kind before they started clawing back bits and pieces of it. So that was one thing. The other thing is, again, he saw himself as French. He was very proud of his blackness, and he would remind people that he was black, but he absorbed the whole philosophy of assimilation, makes you a worthy human being. My culture is inferior. I do have a right to exist, but, being a French citizen is the way to be. So he became the face of this campaign. And of course, after the war ends, the French don't extend citizenship to the people who come back, to the African veterans of the war. And so there's a lot of discontentment. And Blaise Diagne's popularity takes a nosedive. He wasn't really popular to begin with because there were a lot of Africans who felt alienated from his brand of politics. But now, his popularity really suffered. At the same time, he managed to survive as a politician. And he managed to survive as a politician because the other nationalists who could have opposed him, there are people who you read in African history, like Galandou Diouf, Lamine Gueye, all of them were people like Blaise Diagne. They were originaires. They were Africans who had become French citizens, and some of them presented themselves as being to the left of his politics, but really there was not much difference between them and him. And so every time they went to vote in the 1930s, 1920s, and well into the 1930s, Blaise Diagne kept winning the elections. And the only time that another originaire was able to take that seat in Paris was as a consequence of his death sometime in the mid-30s, I forget the exact year. So basically what we see is some form of stasis in nationalist activity in Senegal. It's different voices, but all they are providing is more of the same to an electorate that is disenchanted and living under the heavy yoke of colonialism. So that's that. I'm going to scoot over to Lagos, which is second, well, initially it used to be the capital city of Nigeria, and these days they moved it to Abuja. But anyway, I picked Lagos and the Gold Coast because they didn't really feel that impact of the First World War, either in terms of recruitment or, having war at your doorstep, although you do have some human resources directed towards the war effort. And so not surprisingly, nationalist activity during and after the war takes a sort of parochial form, So this man here, Herbert Macaulay, is a Creole Lagosian. And he took as one of his political points of advocacy the case of, and this is Eleko is a title, so this is an indigenous, the indigenous ruler, Oba Don Sunumo, in Lagos. So basically what happened is, as the British were taking over Nigeria, they tried very hard to either get different merchant princes or chiefs or peoples who didn't have, maybe they were ruled by councils of elders, et cetera, to concede, or where there was some sort of centralized leadership, merchant princes or chiefs, they tried to divorce you from your material base. So people like Jaja Jugobo, of Opobo ended up in exile. He was one of the wealthiest merchant princes. People like Nana Vishekeri, who had made a lot of money in palm oil, ended up, being divorced from his material base. This particular case, but at the same time, they liked to maintain some of them in power because it gave them a way to practice some form of administration. And they actually tended to create chiefs where they didn't exist. So a lot of Igbo people, for example, didn't have chiefs. They just tended to have gendered governments. And so what the British would do in such cases is they would create a warrant chief, and that would be the person who would, communicate to sort of like be the interface between the British administration and their people. So in this particular case, you end up with a man who doesn't have a material base, but the British value his position to their administrative goals. So they gave him a pension, but they didn't provide for his successors. They gave him a pension and an income, but his successors were not provided for. So once he was out of the picture, this seat was basically going to collapse. So you have this odd situation of Herbert Macaulay, a Creole Lagosian, taking this up as a cause. And he's joined by a couple of other Creole politicians like himself. It is odd because people like Herbert Macaulay in West Africa, yes, they're Christian. Some of them even have college education. Many of them are actually opposed to traditional leadership because they see it as archaic. They see it as archaic. They see it as a hindrance to their own political ambitions, and they didn't think they saw it as parochial. Many of them are dealing with particular ethnic groups or particular clans or lineages within a particular ethnic group. It worked great for the British. It's divide and rule. But if you're somebody who is thinking a little more broader, you have larger visions of what it means to be a nation, you develop a sort of antagonistic relationship with these forms of traditional leadership. But he took it on as a point of advocacy because he saw it as disrespect. Treating an African leader, an African indigenous leader in this way to him was a point of disrespect. It also gave them the opportunity to kind of try and build bridges with the African masses in the places they lived with who couldn't really identify with a man like this. Herbert Macaulay, even just the name, it's just, who are you? What sort of leader do you want to be? How are you going to represent us, So it allowed them, if you support an indigenous leader, it kind of creates an opportunity for bridge building. You find a similar situation in the Gold Coast, but in the Gold Coast, there's actually more of a tense relationship between chiefs and these sorts of Creole West Africans. So a man like James Casely Hayford, there were others like John Mensa Saba, Hatton Mills, James Brew, that class of people. They took up a similar cause for similar reasons. But I think in the Gold Coast, the hostility between the factions, was more evident earlier on. Reason being, chiefs felt very vulnerable. They didn't like the idea of these Creoles who looked poised to take over power, being prominent in their own societies. So that relationship was very tense. And then at the same time, for the same reasons as with in Lagos, people like Casely Hayford were uneasy with chiefs. Then you have, of course, the British administration that wants to maintain them in place. So eventually, LegCo means Legislative Council. In British territories, every British territory had a legislative council. So this is something that couldn't exist in French territories, but in British territories, you did have them. And if the territories had no settlers, quite a number of the representatives in that legislative council would actually be people of African descent. So many of these Creoles end up in the legislative council. It's their way of trying to meet their goals within the system. But once they're there, they're not necessarily happy because, for example, in Nigeria, in the colony that was then a colony and protectorate, you had justice systems that were run by administrators. A lot of these educated, in this case, he's a barrister, he's a journalist, they couldn't compete for jobs with Britons in their spaces. So, if you were working in an office, you always were subordinate, you're earning less salaries, et cetera, et cetera. So when they tried to have newspapers, those newspapers, every time they stepped out of line, they would be pulled back in a not very nice way. So they were very uncomfortable with not surprisingly, the racial discrimination that persisted even when they felt that they had absorbed the best of, Western culture. So eventually, you have a number of these Creoles coming together and forming a party called a Congress, but it really did operate like a political party. And this political party was inspired by the end of the First World War, particularly Wilson's 14 points, and all those negotiations that had happened in Versailles, questions of autonomy had come up, just the new nations that had emerged created hope that, you could have new nations emerging in Africa as well. So to help that process along, they create this particular Congress that essentially operated like a national party. And it's unique in that, it's British West Africa. It truly was multinational. So it had representatives from the Gambia, it had representatives from Freetown, Sierra Leone, it had representatives from Lagos, from Nigeria, and then the country that's today Ghana that was then called the Gold Coast. So it really was a regional political party. But, much like happens in Senegal, a lot of stasis seeps into this movement. If you look at their resolutions, because they tried to hold a biannual meeting in Bathurst, Freetown, Lagos, and the Gold Coast. to rotate, and if you look at the resolutions, they're more or less repeating them over and over again through the 1920s. So it shows that nothing is changing, they're not changing much, the membership of the organization isn't changing much, and it's only when you're approaching the Second World War that you will have a different form of nationalism emerging. But really, this is what you have for the period after the First World War. Okay. What's the time? When am I supposed to finish? 12? Oh, 12:45. Okay, so I have 45 more minutes. Okay, so I think we're doing okay. Okay, so I just want to talk about the Pan-African movement because a lot of these West African Creoles ended up in the Pan-African movement. Of course, it's a momentous occasion in history. The reality is it had very little impact on the ground in Africa. And it almost is not held. The reason why Du Bois is able to hold it is actually because Blaise Diagne intercedes for him with Georges Clemenceau. And at that time, Blaise Diagne was supportive of the Pan-African movement. But at least it gave them a place to commune, remiscerate, share, in this dream of an international movement of African diasporic movement that eventually would have political weight and, at least in some ways, help to promote independence and self-autonomy in different parts of Africa. So, they held their session in Paris, they made resolutions. There would be other meetings that would be held, but similarly, nothing much would emerge from them. And actually, Blaise Diagne later on dissociated himself from Pan-Africanism because he felt Du Bois was too radical for him. Blaise Diagne had, by then, in the 1920s, kind of settled into a mode of giving lip service to democratic ideals, but had more or less resigned himself to preserving the rights of, the few thousand originaires in the communes. He had basically given up on the larger French West Africa and, their concerns. So not surprisingly, he doesn't even want to have anything to do with the Pan-African movement. But, it's an important moment in time. And of course, a lot of the resolutions emerging out of this meeting will be reflected in, National Congress of British West Africa's political activities. Okay, so now I'm going to hopscotch this same map. I started here, and then I went here and talked about this. So now I'm going to go all the way to British East Africa, right here. So in British East Africa, we're going to find this man, Harry Thuku. You have to really look hard if you want to talk about nationalism in Africa during this period. But so if you look hard, you will find this man. He belongs to an ethnic group called the Kikuyu. The Kikuyu are a Bantu people in East Africa. And why am I choosing him? I think he's interesting. You can't necessarily call him a nationalist, at least not when he starts his political activism, because nationalist means something. It has to mean multi-ethnic. Maybe you're identifying with some sort of territory. And yes, there are many different kinds of nationalism. But when you start a group, initially when he becomes politically active, the association he joins is called the Kikuyu Association. The Kikuyu Association was an association that was run by Kikuyu chiefs. These chiefs were chiefs of the typical colonial mold, chiefs who have been created for administrative purposes by the British to help them run the territory. He wasn't happy being a member of the Kikuyu Association. He felt it was too staid. It was too laid back for him at a time when the British East African territory was coming under a lot of pressure as a consequence of the First World War. So eventually he forms an organization called the Young Kikuyu Association. So we might ask ourselves, why does he form the Young Kikuyu Association? Because the Young Kikuyu Association is formed just around the time when the First World War is starting. And I think you can make a link between the Yankee Kikuyu Association, the formation of the Yankee Kikuyu Association, and the recruitment of troops in East Africa. In the same way that, you know, the French were recruiting troops for their war effort, the British did the same, only that the British did it mostly to fight within East Africa as opposed to exporting them. So, how many troops are recruited? You know, I have looked at about different sources, and the figure isn't always right. But when you look at the casualty figures, the one that's more or less steady is that about 1 in every 8 African males was lost in that war. And, you know, the British also had a pretty high casualty rate. I think it was something like about 100,000 troops died in the East African theater of war. Why are they being recruited? They're being recruited because if you look at this map, to the south of British East Africa, you have German East Africa. And, you know, at the time when this map was being drawn in Berlin, Bismarck was a spoiler, and he took this part of Africa. So the British had a dream. What the British really would have wanted is a continuous line of territory from the south to the north. In the same way that the French had their own west to east dream. You know, the French had wanted to have territory that stretched all this way, joining what is present-day Djibouti, you know? But, you know, they lost out on this precious stretch of land that has the Nile in it. So what they ended up with was stopping short right here at French Equatorial Africa. So the war provides an opportunity to redraw this map and to secure whatever it is that you already had. So they decide to take the war to Germans here. And it is so important for them because initially the British didn't even have an interest in this territory. What the British really, really wanted was Egypt. And then eventually they end up with Sudan. But then, of course, you have the source of the Nile here. So the reason why they approached the Great Lakes region from the coast here was just so that if we take this territory, we will keep the Germans out of it, and we will make sure that we at least have control of the headwaters of the Nile here. So that was why they took the British East African Protectorate. They didn't really have an economic interest in it. But once they had it, they really came to value it. And they came to value it for 2 reasons. Its soil and its climate. You know, when you read narratives of British travelers or settlers, they always express how, especially when you get to the highlands, it looks and feels like Europe. It's lush, and it's green, and it's cool, unlike the coast here, which is very hot and humid, you know. And the soil of the highlands is very rich. So this part of Africa became very valuable for agriculture. And so what initially was just a by-the-way territory takeover ends up becoming a real settler colony. So the war gives them the opportunity to close this gap. And that's why they're recruiting. That's why there's so much going on here. It doesn't mean that you know, it's going to become a major theater of war. Of course, in many ways, a lot of these wars that are happening on the continent are sideshows. You know, the main show, if I can use those terms, you know, obviously people are dying. But the main show is happening in Europe. These wars that are happening in Africa are much smaller by comparison, and the casualty lists are smaller. But, you know, again, in terms of demographic density, if you're losing 1 in every 8 Africans, it's going to have an impact. So what does this war mean for someone like, that's what this means for the British. What does the war mean for someone like Harry Thuko? Well, for him, is looking at two things. Number one, the weight of the war, the ongoing war on his society, that recruitment effort that really focuses a lot of attention in rural areas. So it leads to demographic loss, and already the rural areas were under pressure because a lot of male Africans had fled the rural areas to the cities because they were trying to avoid a poll tax called, it's a hard tax, basically. So what essentially happened is that, women ended up having to adjust their lives to make up for that male labor that was fleeing to the cities. And now you come up with this process of recruitment, of additional labor. So it's only going to make the situation even worse. The other thing that will offend someone like Harry Thuku is that after the war ended, the British tried to find a way to honor the service of those British soldiers who had fought in the war. You can honor them in different ways, and one of the ways was to turn to the colonies and see if you can, in some way, give them some sort of reward that settles them. Because remember, the war was very disruptive. Just like the Second World War will be, it was very disruptive to economies in Europe. So if you take them to the colonies, you kind of deal with the weight of settling them and rewarding them for their service and taking some of that weight off Britain in Europe. This meant that about 2 million acres of land were alienated for settlement of these. It was actually called the Soldier Settlement Scheme. Yeah, there was a Soldier Settlement Scheme, and 2 million acres were alienated. So 2 million acres in comparison to what has already been alienated, well, actually, Africans had already lost a lot of land. But, we have to see that this land alienation is coming at a time when society is already at a strain. And then you also have to think about what it looks like to, for example, an African war veteran. If you had served in the King's African Rifles, what did you get for your service to the British war effort? Well, you're certainly not getting several hundred acres of land in the Central Highlands. So you can see how this is going to create a lot of ill feelings, And then the other thing is this war effort, the burden, the way it impacted women was that, for example, you start having chiefs recruiting women for road construction. Kikuyu women felt the burden of soil conservation policies. Soil conservation policy, so many S's. So soil conservation policies were controversial for many reasons. Many Africans resented them because they felt that the reason why environmental degradation was happening in the first place was because they had been huddled into reserves. So, you had demographic density weighing in on the land. But now you also have to go out and build terraces and put up gabions. So most of the people doing this labor were women. And then controversially, they were also being sent into plantations. Men had been going into plantations as well, but as a consequence of migration flows out of the rural areas and these sorts of recruitment efforts, you end up with a situation where European settlers need more and more plantation labor, and it's women who end up supplying it. And that was one of the most controversial because a lot of women tended to be very vulnerable to sexual harassment and sexual assault in that sort of situation. And so actually when Harry Thuku becomes politically active, initially his early life, you don't see much that is remarkable. He was a civil servant. He once worked for a bank. Actually, at one time, he's arrested and jailed for a few years for forging a check, and then he ends up working for a European newspaper called the Leader of British East Africa as a typesetter, and he usually credits that with his political activism because he used to read the newspaper as he was typesetting, and he would want to respond, and he became very sensitive to political issues in the colony. So in the end, he forms an organization called the Yankee Kikuyu Association to rival the Chiefs Kikuyu Association. The point at which I think it takes on a more nationalist phase is when, because he was living in Nairobi, the capital of the British East African Protectorate, he would interact with people from multiple ethnic groups. And actually, some of them were from neighboring territories, like the Uganda Protectorate. And so he ended up changing the focus of his political efforts from a Kikuyu-based political platform to one that was more regional. And it was even reflected in the name of his organization. He called it the East African Association, although most of it was concentrated within the British East African Protectorate. And he actually now also made an effort to travel more broadly throughout the Protectorate, as opposed to just concentrating his political activities in certain parts of Nairobi or the central part of the country where the people of his ethnic group were. So at that point, I think you can call that a nationalist movement. This nationalist movement is very short-lived, though. By the early 20s, it comes to an end because the British got very worried. Every time Thuku would have a rally, there would be crowds and crowds of people, and he was a very charismatic person. So they became concerned that this person was going to become a rather disruptive political force. So he ended up being arrested and being taken to a place that actually still exists to this day. There were police lines opposite a hotel called Norfolk. If you go to Nairobi today, Norfolk Hotel is still there, and there's a central police station. It's still in the same place, and he ended up there. And then there was a skirmish, and people died. The numbers are all over the place. But after that, he was exiled to Kismayo. So Kismayo is in modern-day territory of Somalia. So that's where he ends up. And something interesting happens to Thuku when he goes into exile. We don't know much about what happens in Kismayo. Eventually, he's brought back to Kenya. They take him to parts of the country that kind of look like Kismayo. He's in Marsabit, really dry, arid places. And then eventually, he's released and allowed to move, with his normal restrictions. Africans had lots of restrictions. They had passbooks and everything. It's just that there wasn't a formal policy of apartheid. And so he's released, and he comes back a completely different man. When I say he comes back a completely different man, for example, when he comes in the 1920s, there's a movement in Kikuyu land, two major movements. One is called the Kikuyu Independent Schools Association and the Kikuyu Karinga Education Association. These associations were focusing on trying to set up schools that were independent of missionary influence. They wanted Kikuyu children to go to schools where you're not taught that your culture is inferior, that your religion is inferior. They wanted them to have a different kind of education where, yes, you come out, you're able to write and skills, et cetera, but you still have an appreciation of your identity. That was the happening thing when Harry Thuku finally goes back to Kikuyu land. He wanted nothing to do with these movements. These movements are controversial for many other reasons. I just won't go into it right now. But he didn't want anything to do with these movements. He also didn't join any of the political activities that seemed to be, reflective of his own political orientation before he went into exile. It seemed that to him they were now too radical. And then something that really confused people was that Thuku made peace with a chief, a Kikuyu chief named Warohio. You know, by virtue, Yankee Kikuyu Association, you remember, was a rival organization to the Kikuyu Association that was run by, Kikuyu chiefs. Kikuyu chiefs ended up being seen as, the bucket boys of the empire, et cetera, et cetera. So Harry Thuku in his younger days, was opposing that. So he comes back and he makes peace with Warohio. And a lot of Kikuyus are like looking and thinking, what's happened to this man? And then he goes on and he builds a really remarkable stone house, in the European way. Like a lot of houses in this part of Africa were circular. He builds a stone house, rectangular in the European way. And then, 1930s, he's allowed to grow coffee, which was something that was a privilege preserved for Europeans, because of course it was a very highly valued cash crop. But Harry Thuku somehow is allowed to cultivate coffee. So he starts to look, well, it's a really strong word, but, some people are looking at him and thinking, this man has become a traitor. What happened to the Harry Thuku we knew before he left? So some people say the experience of exile broke him. It just broke him, Who knows what was happening in Kismayo? Some people say that as a consequence of the wealth he created in Marsabit, apparently when he was in Marsabit, he was able to cultivate a relationship with the British administrator there who allowed him to engage in certain agricultural activities that created wealth that he then used to build his house, et cetera, et cetera. He started to see British rule in a different way. That's also very plausible, Even more remarkably for people is that by the time you get to the 1940s, late 40s, early 50s, and at that time you have a very violent uprising called the Mau Mau Rebellion, Harry Thuku goes on radio and he makes a speech denouncing it. People were like, wow, we knew you had changed, but we didn't realize you had changed this much, But he goes on the radio and denounces this movement. And after that, he kind of just slips into obscurity, And again, you start to see certain patterns emerge, as far as nationalism is concerned in Africa after the war. And then I wanted to talk about an interesting form of nationalism. These are the things that also made me change the title of this lecture. You see, I do think that there's a nationalism, too, that you can identify with British settlers in the East African Protectorate. In 1906, by executive order, a legislative council is promulgated in the East African Protectorate. So you can see it here. It's not very clear, but I just also wanted to point out that this flag is a flag of the East African Protectorate with the lion as its insignia. And as you notice there, it's very white. Initially, it was all white. And then Asians in the East African Protectorate protested at the whiteness of this legislative council. And so the British conceded the next year and they gave them one representative, which they still were not happy with because there were more Asians in the East African Protectorate than there were Europeans. But they were not calling the shots. So it stayed on as it was. But even the British settlers in the East African Protectorate were not happy with this legislative council. They were not happy with it for different reasons. Number one, yes, it's all white, but they didn't like that there were so many officials sitting in there with them. And they also didn't like that it was the executive, the British administration, that was choosing, there were nominated settler representatives in the Legislative Council. There was no election. They wanted an elective process. The dream that the British settlers had was that eventually one day we would have a dominion. We would have something that, would look like New Zealand or Australia in East Africa. That's what they wanted to work towards. But if you're having a legislative body to which you're being appointed, that's very far off from what your ideal government looks like. So they actually were not, they were happy that, okay, now we have a legislative council, but its form and the control that the executive had over it did not satisfy them. So they had alternative spaces for political expression. For example, Europeans all over the highlands were organized into district associations. And a district association looked like a small political party, and it drew its members from Europeans in a particular association. And most of the time, they focused mostly on agricultural activities because that was where the money was. And then, eventually, these multiple associations came together and they formed an organization called the Convention of Associations. And this convention came to be seen as some sort of quasi-European parliament, like a rival parliament to the Legislative Council. And, every year or so, the governor of the protectorate would actually go and address the Convention of Associations. So they used this Convention of Associations as a place to advocate for the sort of country that they wanted. And they made two moves during the World War. The most significant happened actually around 1915, when they take advantage of the empire's desire to take the war to German East Africa to launch an effort to set up a committee that they argued would help the British organize the war effort and ensure stability once the war was gone. And they made it very clear that this political initiative was not an attempt to unseat the state, the colonial state. But in many ways, that was the goal. And eventually, Boring, who you see here, C.C. Boring, actually agrees to the setting up of this committee. And as soon as it's set up, settlers then unleash a new range of requests that when the war is over, this committee will become a committee that can actually take care of the economic needs of the protectorate. If you're going to be controlling the economic affairs of the protectorate, you're pretty much going to be running the show in the protectorate. Were they successful? No, they were not successful. They were not successful because Britain was not ready to hand over that level of power to settlers in East Africa. But they did try, and they continued trying, and I think that was a form of nationalism as well. Okay, one last one, and then we can move on. I wanted to talk about the Union of South Africa. And the reason why I wanted to talk about the Union of South Africa is because if you look at this gray here, you have more German territory. So you can see what Germany lost as a consequence of its being on the losing end of the World War. They lost German East Africa, they lost Southwest Africa, and then they lost this space here, part of which also is, and then they also lost Cameroon, which was shared between the French and the British. So this territory here was also of interest. And the Union of South Africa, this is an interesting scenario here because we know the history of the Anglo-South African War, what is otherwise known as the Anglo-Boer War, and how you have this uneasy peace being made between Afrikaners and the British. And so when they launched war against Southwest Africa, the head of state of South Africa and General Smuts, they actually portrayed as a great nationalist moment. We are uniting in taking over this territory to our north, which will also help us secure our border. But also at the same time, we are helping British goals. And there were even efforts to take Boers to fight in German East Africa. So, but at the same time, those persistent divisions didn't go away. And some of them were even heightened just by the way the military effort was organized. So, for example, the cavalry tended to be Afrikaners. And then South Africans of British descent, they tended to be the infantry. The cavalry would go fast, and then the infantry would follow for cleanup, etc., etc. Their war strategies were different, as a consequence of the Anglo-South African War. We know the Boers had really refined guerrilla warfare. The British tended to have a more systematic war process. So those differences would emerge here. But the head of state of South Africa tended to he would paper over them because he was trying to use this conflict to bolster his own political position in South Africa and to sort of unite the country. The country had its own divisions, which Botha and Jan Smuts were very much aware of. I've mentioned, for example, the whole tension between Afrikaners and the British. And actually, this is a very quick job. I think it's over in less than 7 months. They had solved this problem. The casualty list is also quite short. I just can't remember it. But then after this, as a consequence of taking the war here, tensions erupt in South Africa. And they erupt amongst Afrikaners who felt that Smart and Botha were too friendly with the British. They sort of felt like they had an agenda, a secret agenda to Anglicize South Africa. We've just fought a very bitter war. Then we have a union, we are somehow managing to make some sort of political capital, even though we came out of that war, disadvantaged. But all of a sudden, you have people like Smuts who are running around trying to please the British, it seems to them. So these are the sorts of people who eventually come together and form the Nationalist Party, which is they have a form of nationalism that's very ethnic. This will be the Nationalist Party that eventually will win elections in the 1940s and formally institute the policy of apartheid. And a major instigator is the activities of the state in the war. There were other parties as well. They had a Labour Party that was, pro-British. They had a Unionist Party that was also pro-British. And actually, Botha manages to win elections. The nationalists are not successful, although they do eventually enter an alliance with Labour. But it's only when you will get to the 1940s that they will actually be able to, take over the state and run the show in the way they want. In the meantime, as we know, also South Africa changes. By 1961, they don't even recognize the Queen as head of state anymore. I think that actually ends in the 1930s. So let me stop here. I think I should stop here and allow people to ask questions. Okay, I've talked so fast, but I just felt a lot of pressure of time. So, okay, thank you. Okay, no questions. I don't think they have questions. I'm so eager to flee. Yeah, I think they were not able to do it, mostly because it was just very difficult to do it. Even if you were willing to become assimilated, you had to have the means to realize it. You had to have a place where you could learn the language. You had to at least have a Catholic mission near you, which they didn't have, or which they didn't have many outside of those communes. You had to have the means to get a decent education. So it was just really difficult. And that's even the reason why the French themselves abandon it and opt for association. Because assimilation was a very difficult policy to enact when your primary goal is an economy that's extractive, an economy that's geared towards creating capital that you then expatriate to Paris. How are you going to do that and at the same time invest the resources that you need in ensuring that people can be fully assimilated and eventually acquire voting rights? It's just too big of a mountain to climb in terms of economics. So they realized it wasn't going to work. And then, it's not as if their expansive nationalism is unchallenged. It's being challenged. There are all manner of wars being waged in the hinterland. And, they just realized it's going to be too hard. This territory of French West Africa went through several periods of jihads, in the 1800s. So how are you going to then all of a sudden somehow make everyone Catholic? It was not going to work. So that's why they opted for association. And people like Blaise Diagne, in the end, they never really had an interest in the hinterland either. So people were just kind of left to their own devices from there. Okay, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.